So you can see we have this, you can start with the Docker Compose file, and we can see we have this Postgres image, right, and it's setting the password and user, the initial database here. The port is kind of obvious, right? You can see like when we kind of initialize, this is, what's occurring. That we need the Postgres image set up. Again, the volumes, the logs. There's one other thing. Okay, this stuff is kind of valuable. We can see where we can connect to our Postgres database from, right? At PostgreSQL, airflow, right? This is the user and password. Then from there, if you look at the pipeline, it's a little long, I admit, but let's see how we can read something like this. What I would do is like go to the end, essentially. And you can see these are the steps involved. All right? So fetch and save, wait for JSON, read the JSON file, send to Postgres, trigger DAG2. That's kind of interesting, right? We haven't seen that before. Then fetch, it seems like from Postgres, save to CSV, wait for the CSV to be saved, and then save this CSV to S3, right? So we're getting data from an external resource. Make sure we have it and that it's like saved as JSON. Once we have it, we're gonna send this to Postgres, and then move to the next step. So the first step is essentially getting our data from an external API, and then ultimately saving this data first to a JSON file and then to Postgres. Once that occurs, we get the data from Postgres, save it to an S3 file, and then ultimately send that S3 file, save it as a CSV, and then ultimately send the CSV file to S3. All right, so it's like we can start to see the process here. And then you can just click on these various steps to really like dig deep. So it's like reading an essay, right? Like first we get the general overview of what's occurring, and then we can click on any one of these steps to see what happens. So for instance, I'm pressing down Command, and then I can click. This takes me to fetch and save, right? And I can see that's part of this first DAG. And the important thing for me is really this method, obviously, that it calls. All right, so here you can see we're getting data from this API, and I guess he's like doing some sort of analysis on it, adding it up, and then eventually he's writing this file, right, to /covid.json. All right, so this is going to all be inside our Docker container. So this is the first step, is basically hit the API, save this to JSON. Let's go down again to see what the next step is. Wait for JSON. So this is interesting. This is like this Python sensor thing. We can Google like how this works, but essentially what it does is it looks to see, does this function return true? And what this function is doing is saying, hey, is that file there, right? When the file is there, then it will move on to the next step. So let's go back down again. So the first thing we did was make sure we get the data, save it to a JSON file. Then we get to this wait for JSON thing, which calls a Python sensor, which says when this function returns true, when this file is actually saved on our system, then we can move on. All right. Let's see the next thing that happens. Then finally, now that we know that this is on our system, we read the JSON file. Let's see what this function does. Okay, so it loads up, it basically loads up the data from from the file that we just wrote, and now it stores it in memory, and it's going to actually, I don't love the fact that they did this, but it's okay. It's going to actually send this to the next task. So this is essentially just involved with reading the JSON file into memory, and then eventually we're going to send this to another task. So this is something new. I do have a reading about it. It's this XCOM thing. All right. Let me explain what this does. And by the way, there's a reading for this. Like, I expect you guys, and you can kind of play around with this. What the XCOM thing does is normally these tasks are meant to be independent, meaning like if you think about it, we don't really get a return value and then send that return value to something else. Like Airflow is not, with its default behavior, designed that way. So it's like, how do we take the contents of this JSON file and then we use it in this task? All right, this is the problem that the XCOM is trying to deal with. So what happens is you read the data, right? So this is just going to be like some JSON, like a list of values. We have these names. And we store these values in this, basically in memory. So this is just a dictionary essentially, where names is going to point to these values and active numbers is going to point to like other values. So you can imagine that basically what we're doing is we're just, when we do xcom.push, the key of names storing this list and key of active values storing this list, that really like we kind of have a dictionary called names that points to a list of values. And then we have active numbers, okay, which points to another list of values. Now, in the next task, you can see what we're doing. We have this other task. We're pulling down from the read JSON file task this, our key of names. So we're pulling in this data from the previous task. That's what XCOM pull is doing, right? So this is how we're able to get data from one function, from one task, and then pull it and use it into another task. And now we're doing the same thing with this. We just pushed active numbers, and now we're pulling in from the key of active numbers from this read JSON file task, right? And we're storing it here. So essentially what we're doing is just passing data, right? This is data that we originally read in this task from a file, and now we're going to push it in, in this XCOM thing, and then pull it once we get to the previous task, okay? From here, we connect to Postgres, create a new table, and insert in the data, right? So we're going through the data, the list of names and active numbers, and inserting in that data. And then finally, close it. And now that we've saved the data in Postgres, we're done with our JSON file. We don't really need it anymore. Okay. Let's see what happens next. And now what happens next is it says trigger DAG2. All right, so we could see how this works. But really what happens now is, okay, we call this thing. So we finally get the data that we just saved from Postgres, create a CSV. So here's the data frame. Save it to CSV. And now we have this CSV file on our computer. And then from there, we do the same thing, Python sensor, wait for the CSV. Finally, we will send the CSV file to S3, okay? So you can see, like, this takes, obviously, I don't expect you guys to like follow all this right here. But like you can see, you can follow this, right? Like this is something that you can follow the path for if you just, go step by step by step. All right? These are just functions. That's all that's happening. We're calling one function after the other. Okay? There are, things that are like a little different to point out. One is, notice they're not really using the connections thing that we saw in Airflow previously. They're just simply like connecting. They're just using Scicop G2. They're not doing that whole like Postgres connector thing that we saw previously. Personally, I like this. I like this technique better because it means we don't have to go through the connections, clicking through stuff. We just kind of run this code and it works. All right, so that's one thing that's new. Also notice that that in order to connect, we can just specify that the host is Postgres. Why can we do that? Like, why can we just say, hey, connect to Post? Where does this come from? Remember, we're inside Docker Compose, so we have a service called Postgres, and it's able to connect. Say this is essentially the IP address, right? We're able to refer to the IP address as Postgres. Okay. Other things. Okay, the last thing that's happening is they're using this Bado3 library. You can see that this Bado3 library is a Python library that allows you to interact with AWS. All right? So what are they doing? They're first getting basically the correct API data, like your API, and we're going to set this up in a minute, but they're getting the configurations of, here's my AWS access key, here's a secret access key, right? This is going to allow me to interact with my S3 service. And then once we have this, then we can upload the CSV file that we previously created in a bucket. Okay? So this is how, again, like they're not using the connections to connect to AWS. They're using this Bado3 client and then pulling out the AWS access key, the secret access key, the bucket, things like that they need. You can see where this comes from. This comes from json.load output this file, configurations.json. All right? Where does that file come from? It's included with this. So here's my configurations.json file. We're going to put our secret access key and our AWS access key here. Right? Here's the service, region, bucket. Right? We'll fill out a bucket name. That's going to be read here. Okay? So that's going to be read from here. So this is allowing us to log in, right? This is us basically entering our username and password, right, for AWS. And then we get to upload the file. All right? What I want to do before we kind of move forward, let me let you guys read through this code base, look through it, try to understand it, and then we can set it up. All right. Okay. So I'll just give you guys maybe 15, 20 minutes just as a first pass. This way you can look through it, can ask questions when you come back, and then we can see this in action. All right. If you want to try to set it up, you can. It's not so bad. All you have to do is, go to AWS and basically create the secret access key that allows you to access your S3, and then just place it in here. All right. And then you also need create an S3 bucket that you have access to. That's it. All right. But we'll do that in a little bit. Questions before, kind of any initial questions about this? Let me scroll down to the end. You can see these tasks.
Hey Jeff, how was it able to call the configurations JSON? So it's not .client, but I didn't see how that connected to that JSON file.
Sure. So it's opening the file here, temp conf file configurations.json.
Okay.
This file, right? We must be able to get this file in our container. So that's happening because we have a bind mount.
So it's on your machine, and then it's okay.
Right.
Bind
so you
mounted.
can see that
Okay.
we have this, bind mount right here. Yeah, that takes it here and then moves it directly to this file in the container.
Cool.
Right? Or really, it's a portal essentially.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Other questions about this? The reason why, I think this is complex, obviously, But like if you are given like an airflow problem, like asking you to do ETL, like for instance, this haystack ETL problem, like now you can really like start with this code base, modify it, and like what I think you should also do is start refactoring this code base a little bit, right? Just a way to work with it and understand it better. Other questions before I let you all just take a look at this? No? Okay, so like the main, again, just to emphasize some of the main differences is from what we've seen previously is one, they're not really using connections, all right? They're using just Python libraries to make the connection. They're doing that with this scicop G2, right? Where they're connecting to this Postgres instance and saving data in there. And then two, they're doing that again with the Botto 3, right? I personally think this is better, right? Because you can just clone down this repo, fill in this information, and you're done. And you don't really need to, do any sort of clicking through stuff. Like there's not really any manual tasks. All right, let me stop. We wait. So we get the data from the API. We write a local copy, like a JSON file, right, inside our container. Then we read from the JSON file and then immediately send that to Postgres. So the question is, I guess, like, why not just directly send this to S3? Or, we could have just stored a CSV file and do that. I think, like, it could be, like these files that are inside your container, like they're just there, like, he's just storing them there temporarily. And they're not really bind mounted. So once we, shut down our container, like they're gone. With sending it to S3, as long as this is stored in a volume, like at least we do have this data structured, on wherever the Airflow server is before we then like try to make sure this works in the cloud, right? And then we send it to S3. So it could be a way essentially of just like capturing the data locally or wherever your AWS server is before moving it over and like making sure like the authentication is set up properly, like, if in case someone deletes the bucket or something, we have this data before we try to send it over to S3. So it could be that. It's not a bad approach. He could, like, let me just diagram what's going on. So we get to the external API. And then we write the file, store the file locally, meaning like, let me do a big, this is Airflow. Okay. And then Airflow is connected to Postgres. All right. So we hit the API, right? And then we have this JSON file that we store here. And then they take the JSON file and they store it locally. Or not, this database could be anywhere, but they store it directly on Postgres. And I guess they're pretty confident about that connection. Then from there, they have the next task, read this. I'll just call this read. From Postgres, right, to a CSV, essentially. And then from there, they take the CSV and they write that to S3. So these files, like the JSON file and the CSV, the JSON file, right, like is really just stored temporarily, and and it's contained inside our Airflow container, right? But this Postgres, at least now we are like storing the data, uh, you know, in a database. And I guess he's kind of just using it as like local temporary storage that I guess he's more confident about than storing it in the container. So now we have this stuff in Postgres. And as long as we have this connected to a volume, we won't lose it, which is what he does. And then from there, he can have it in S3. Another question could be like, why can't we be done when we store it in Postgres? Like, why, like we store this thing in Postgres, maybe should be done. That's not a bad thought. Like lots of times, like data will be transferred through S3 for like data analysts or marketing team or things like that. Like this is kind of like the final report would be S3. It's also just good to see like how these different pieces connect, right? But you could imagine a different architecture of, let's say if we had a scraper, hit the external data, immediately like save it maybe locally, take that data, store it in S3, and then perform some transformations to then load it into Postgres or something like that, right? So you could imagine different variations of this. In this case, I think what's happening is he doesn't like he likes the idea of storing this in something more securely than just like a JSON or CSV file on inside the Airflow container, and prefers, okay, let's store it here, we have it, and now we can finish the job and move it over to S3. That's my sense. All right. But yeah, they're definitely like, I would say it's fair to like think through this architecture, and in different, this is not like, I think this is a good code base in terms of connecting these different pieces, show them how they can be used, but like, designing a good system, like it takes thought. All right. So what we need to do to get this thing running, you can see I already booted up, did the Docker Compose. So all I did was just run Docker Compose up at this point. And then you can see the services running with Docker Compose PS. All right. So you can see, this is the name of the folder I'm in, right? These different, and then what I'm really paying attention to is what's after the second to last hyphen. Postgres 1, the scheduler, the web server. If we go here to localhost 8080, I think I guess I've already logged in. This is a shame. Because it's in volumes, it has stored my my previous runs, but it's okay. We'll do it again. All right. So what we're going to need to do to actually like connect this to S3, because if you think about it, ultimately, kind of the tricky part is this part right here, where we're going to need to use our configuration to then eventually upload a file. Remember, this is the file that's in our Docker container up to S3. So essentially what we need to do is first we need to create a bucket. So we can do that by going to S3, AWS. Let's see, hopefully I'm logged in still. All right, and we'll just type in S3. Right, and now let's create a new bucket. So we'll call this Airflow Jigsaw. It has to be a unique name, like across S3 services. So that's why, hopefully this will be unique. You can see the region is US East 1. Objects in this bucket are only owned by this account, and basically we specify the policies for it. For now, I'm going to enable public access. I want to kind of make this easier myself rather than use like fine-grained permissions. Bucket versioning, we don't need to worry about that. So I just unchecked this, kept this default for now. I think we're okay. Let's do, yeah, Tim.
Right, if you use Airflow Jigsaw, that means we can't. The names are like shared across everyone.
Yeah, but you won't be
AWS
able
user.
to, yeah, I think you cannot use this name.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Right, you can see, like, for instance, if we choose Airflow, I would, normally it would, let's see, if my guess is somebody else. See that? Bucket with the same name already exists. All right. But that's not from me. Like, that's from some other. Actually, I guess maybe I've already used this. Jigsaw practice. Let's see if this works. Let me refresh this. Let me just take a look at my buckets. Yeah, it did not create it. Let's try this again. Jigsaw, practice, airflow. Oh, the sample airflow. I did have a similar bucket name that I deleted, and I wonder if it's somehow conflicting with that. So what I did was allow for the public access. Should be able to create the bucket.
There's like a knowledge thing on the public access that you have to check off if you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, now we should be good. All right. So here's the new bucket, Jigsaw sample airflow. The next thing we're gonna need to do, so we can see that this is US East 1. So kind of right now, we can go to this part, this configurations.json. We have the bucket name, Jigsaw sample airflow. We also know that this is US East 1. We have that, we know the service that we're using is S3. And this is a file that ultimately we're going to load into this bucket. Okay, so we don't have the file currently. This is what we're telling, Airflow, or we're telling, our code, this is what we want to call the file ultimately that we're going to be uploading. So what we need to do now is input like a secret access key and AWS access key ID that has access to our S3 bucket, right? That is allowed to basically create and upload data into our S3 bucket. Because this is kind of the idea, right? We log in and authenticate, and then we upload our data, right, to this bucket with this file, which is coming from here. So what we should do is go to the IAM policy and create a user who has access, who has basically full S3 access. We'll do this from scratch. We'll do add a user. Let's call this S3 Airflow access. And I'm going to say programmatic access. Okay, and the reason why is, right, this is going to give me the access key ID and the secret access key, right, which is what I'm going to need to input into here. Next, permissions. Okay, so you can kind of, if you've already done this, you can like say, oh, we've kind of already done this. We're going to give this user the same permissions as people from this group, right? But let's assume you haven't. We can click on attach existing policies directly. And then I just want to give S3 full access, right? This way it can upload and read. Then we'll do next tags, next review. And then if we create user, we can see here's the policy, full access. We have this. All right, so now it gives me, the access key ID, the secret access key ID. We'll destroy this guy later. So I'm just gonna copy this. This is my access key ID. So that's this thing right here. And then we have the secret access key ID. So that's this thing right here. All right. And now we should be pretty good, I think. Let's go back to Airflow. Let's click on this. Just pay attention, right? We have 2 successes, 0 fails. And the other thing we can, or sorry, 1 fail. The other thing we can check is if we go to S3, right? Essentially, our whole goal is we want something to pop up in this bucket, this jigsaw sample airflow, right? Which we set up here. Right, so let's trigger this. So this thing has to happen first. This get API send Postgres. The reason why is because if you remember the code, this first DAG is what creates a table. Let me see if I can show you it. Send to Postgres. This send to Postgres operator is going to create the table, this COVID table, all right, and then insert in the data. So we first need this step to happen before the second DAG then takes the data from Postgres, all right? So if you run these, so you can't just skip the first step. We have to run this one initially. So let's click on it. And notice there's 2 runs in the first one, 2 successful runs in the first one, and 4 in the second one. And then we can trigger the DAG. We can do trigger. Now, what should happen is not only will this first one run, so this should, you can see this is running, but this second one should also run after the first one. And the reason why, even though we did not click trigger this guy, the reason why we should see both of them run is because, remember, the last step here is to trigger DAG2. And what trigger DAG2 does is it uses this new thing called a trigger DAG operator. And you can see that the DAG that it triggers is this get PSQL send S3, right? So we kind of, this is the last task, is to, if you look at your DAG, can I do it this way? Get PSQL send S3, right? That's the last step, is that this thing is called and it triggers the DAG that has that same identifier we just saw. All right. So let's refresh. Let's see how we're doing. Okay, this went up to 3. This guy went up to 5. All right, so both of these look successful. And if we refresh this, there it is. So here's our COVID-19 data. And if you click on this, oh man, we should be able to download it. XML, damn it. Well, there must be a way to get this because I did it before. Oh, maybe I can just go here. Man, can I go there? Our data is uploaded, but I'll have to, unless someone can help me, see how we can read it. Should I be able to just get this? The XML does. I don't know. Previously, I was able to just download it from here. So I don't know why not. But it is up there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen this. All right. So I'll try to figure that out, why I can't see this. But you can see, right, all of our steps were successful. And you can also click, remember, on any one of these things and see the details of this, all right? Then this triggered the second DAG, and then finally we went to this other DAG. Here's this 5th success. Right, and this ultimately did send this to S3. All right, so what we needed to do was essentially just create a bucket, right? And then we need to create an IAM policy where we gave permissions of that user to the bucket, and then we put in the authentication information here. All right, and that did a lot of things, right? It hit the API. Here we go. It ultimately hit an API, took that data, loaded it to JSON, read the data into Postgres, took the Postgres data, saved it to a CSV, and then took that CSV file and uploaded it to S3, which we finally got to. All right. So that's what I would kind of go through. And now you have like a pretty good sample. In terms of like how to play with this code base afterwards, I would start like moving some of this. Remember, I really don't like these like long functions here that could just be run independent of Airflow. So I would, maybe create like a client file and start moving this. Here's really, fetching my data and just return it, right? So I could just call, fetch JSON. And here's like my response, and then from here, take the response and save it into this active numbers, right? He's basically pulling in the data he wants, right? Select attributes, right? So you can really start just having something that works independent of Airflow, and then have Airflow trigger these steps. That's what I recommend, right? Because then, again, like if you ever want to change from Airflow to Prefect, most of the code is independent of Airflow. And, we can test this data locally without anything from Airflow at all, right? We can test a lot of our code without complicating it with Airflow. So that's why I recommend, refactoring this to move this into separate files and keep it fairly independent of Airflow. All right, so I think the next, we'll probably give you guys the majority, if not the rest